Hello everyone! In this tutorial, I want to show you how to quickly add lighting effects to your Webtoon panels so you can immediately make your scene look more interesting. So I'll use this panel as an example. I want to introduce the effect that this guy is coming from the shadows towards a sunlit place. So to add that effect, I created a new clip layer and I'm gonna choose a color that is kind of pale purplish, and using a normal brush, I'm gonna brush over, for example, let's say, the top part of his head. And then I'll change this layer mode to multiply. I can also use the blur tool by going over here and choosing blur. Then, with this tool, I can blur the edges of my shade. Because it's a shade coming from a far place, so smoothing it out indicates that it is a far light source. I can also lock this layer and airbrush while choosing a very warm color from over here, for example, light reddish color, and I can just airbrush the edge of the shade to have a transition between the shading color and the sunlight color. I can also introduce a cooler color in the shadows. For example, I can use this pale dark blue and airbrush over here. So my shading layer is looking like this now. Instead of being just pale purple, I introduced a hint of a warm color on the edge here and a darker color over here, and I can add even more. We can also make the lighting effect more dramatic by introducing a new layer on top of everything without clipping it to the character, and choosing a yellowish color, and with an airbrush I can airbrush over here. And for highlights, I try out the following layer modes. For example, color dodge, glow dodge, add glow, hard light, sometimes overlay. But for this particular scene, I think I'm gonna use a more yellowish color that's not so light, and I'll airbrush and set its mode to add glow. For example, you can immediately see this dramatic effect happening. Or hard light. These are my favorite layer modes. If I want to go for hard light, I'll use a slightly lighter color. And I can also create a new layer and use a combination of both, so a little bit of hard light and a little bit of add glow. So that gave me intense lighting. So for the lighting, generally in daylight settings, I use warm colors for the lights, for example ranging from yellow to red. And for the shadows, I use cool colors ranging from violet to blue. So I'll choose a pale dark bluish color like this, and I'll create a new layer and set the mode to multiply and airbrush over here on the dark side to make it darker. So now with those simple 3 layers, I immediately introduce this interesting lighting. Or instead of multiply, I can also use hard light and use a darker color, because hard light layer mode kind of projects the color that you have onto your colors. So choosing a dark color, saturated color, can allow me to introduce this effect. If I compare this with using multiply, multiply feels less vivid, but hard light has that vividness. I can also use linear burn or color burn. You can experiment around a lot with layer modes and see what interesting thing you can come up with. And of course, you can adjust the overall balance of your panel with color balance tool, dragging highlights towards yellow, shadows maybe towards blue, magenta, and see how it's looking more interesting now. Another cool effect I really like to make use of is making intense lighting, which is very simple to add. So I'll create a new clip layer on my character and set its mode to multiply. Then I'll choose the color that I'm going for. For example, I want to go for maybe a purplish look. So with a brush, I can just brush over my scene and then erase the edges of the character to indicate that this is backlighting and have this intense lighting effect. And after you subtract those highlighted parts, you can adjust again with your pen. If you don't want to subtract directly from your shadow layer, then you can create a layer mask by clicking on your shading layer and then clicking on this button over here, create layer mask, and then erasing stuff or painting to bring it back. Regardless of any color you have chosen, it will still paint over. And you can use a soft eraser as well to make the surroundings less intense. And the nice thing with layer masks is that you can right-click the mask and untick enable mask. So that means that all the erasing was done on the mask itself, so you can easily edit it anytime. Even if, for example, you make edits to the base shading layer. For example, we can introduce more red and some blue. So that means my shading layer right now looks like this. But by playing around with the shades on the mask itself, I can edit those so easily. And to make the lighting even more dramatic, you can create another clip layer and set its mode to multiply, and maybe airbrush also on the middle part of the character. And to make it even more intense, you can create a new clip layer and change its mode to add glow, and then pick a color for highlights, for example this orangish color, and then you can add highlights. This gives the feeling that there is backlighting of yellow color. And of course you can make your shades darker to increase that contrast, so that makes your highlights look more effective, and play around also with the opacity of the highlights part, and so on. It's really fun to play with the colors and the lighting. This is really my favorite part. By using layer modes, that's how I was able to create this kind of lighting. I used similar methods, shading the characters first and then adding highlights on their edges with an add glow layer or a hard light layer. In this example, the highlights are blue, so I added a cyan color with a hard light on the edge of the character, and then added a glow dodge layer again with the same color, and then added a multiply layer over here with a pale blue color. And that's also how I made those powers glowy, by introducing a glow dodge layer on top of the power. And also I made this character glow by adding a glow dodge layer on top of him only to introduce this effect. If you like this tutorial and want to see more of this, then you can see the full version on my Class 101 page. Over there I have a full class on webtoon drawing from the planning to the publishing stage, where I shared all my tips for creating a complete webtoon chapter. And the great thing is that you can try it for free now for 14 days, since Class 101 launched a new subscription-based service called Class 101 Plus. It will allow you to access my webtoon drawing class for a very affordable price, starting with a free trial, so you can try my class in this period and hopefully kickstart or improve your webtoon drawing journey. Check the description box for the link to access my class.